Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the second of the monthly lecture series of the Ad hoc Group on Food, Culture and Society of the Indian Sociological Society. It's a new initiative, and as a very new RC, Adaptive on Food, I thoroughly thank everyone for showing up at 7:30 p.m. IST on an evening. And today I'm very honored to have Professor Krishnendu Ray with us, who is going to talk about hard and soft power, changing histories and dynamics of accumulation. Very quickly introducing our esteemed speaker, he is a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University. He was the chair of the department from 2012 to 2021. He's the author of The Migrant Stable, 2004, and The Ethnic Restaurateur, 2016, and the co-editor of Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food, and South Asia, 2012, and Practicing Food Studies, 2024. He was a faculty member and the acting associate dean of liberal arts at the Culinary Institute of America and the president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society from 2014 to 18. He is an editor of the food studies journal Gastronomica. His most recent work is available as co-edited special issues, one on street food in food, culture and society, and another on food in the Indian Ocean world, mobility, materiality, and cultural exchange in Global Asia's initiative. I'm really thankful that Professor Ray has had agreed to deliver this lecture, as well as become a life member of the ISS very recently. And give a very quick overview of the presentation today, he's going to interrogate the relationship between hard and soft power and the challenges of accumulating them by taking the case of Indian culinary culture as it is represented in high-end restaurant cuisines across global cities, and it provides original data and conceptual arguments about the changing geocultural landscape. So over to you, Professor Ray. Maybe after you speak, we'll have a Q&A where participants will get a chance to know more from you about your work.
Perfect. Thanks, Professor Padgiri, for inviting me. And I see some familiar faces. I see Lily there. I see Beauty. I'm going to share a PDF and get started quickly. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining so late. And it's morning in New York City. I'm speaking from Washington Square Village and Washington Square Park. So today my talk is on hard and soft power. I'm going to just set a time alarm for me. I'll take the case of Indian cuisine, as Rituparn said. And so this is a view from far. The nature of soft power that I'm going to talk about is, in fact, outside India. So I'm, in fact, not going to talk almost anything about inside India, but, in fact, a view from far. So let's see. This is an example. Many of you would be familiar with this brand, Indian Accent. The chef just changed recently. Example, blue cheese naan with a pumpkin bisque with garam masala. Arguably, the most interesting kind of high-end cuisine I have had in a long time. So my presentation is kind of a response to Veer Sanghvi's two pieces and a number of pieces he has written. One, July 24, 2023, he says, if you're interested in food, then you have probably heard of New York's Dhamaka. In the year it opened, the New York Times put it at #1 in its list of city's top 10 new restaurants. And this is, he underlines, this is amongst all restaurants, not just Indian restaurants. It is, by an objective standard, the most successful Indian restaurant in the Western world, end quote. About a year later, he wrote, nobody disputes that Indian food is now taken more seriously globally, but what about Indian restaurants? That's a tough one, but my instinct is to say yes. In fact, my presentation is a bit of kind of a dialogue and a response to some of these assertions. So let me start with the obvious. And one of my arguments is going to be that soft power, of course, by the nature of it, is linked to hard power. And the crudest form of measuring hard power is economic power, which is on your right. You can see this is projected for 2028, highly likely, unless there's a catastrophic crisis, India will become, the Indian economy will become at least the second largest economy in the world. And right now it's hovering in the top few. And that's, of course, partly related to the size of the Indian population. Another crude form of notions of hard power is, of course, military expenditure. And you will see there India up there amongst the biggest powers today. So there is no doubt that India is an emerging hard power, and one can call it superpower, etc. The question, my question is, what is the relationship between this and certain forms of cultural idioms, in my particular case, cuisine, which has been relatively understudied compared to, say, Frederick Jameson just passed away. And for instance, he has studied the relationship between power, global capitalism, and literature. David Harvey's work on postmodernity, in fact, is an argument also about architecture, urbanism, and hard power and soft power. So we see this continental shift. This is that emerged in the, this is, I think, comes out of the data in The Economist. Biggest economies in the world, we see India amongst the top in the world. Now I'm going to plunge you into data from New York City. The most detailed data I have over time is Zagat's, which, and you see the range here is from 1986 to 2016. I stopped in 2016 because Zagat got sold to Google, and they stopped collecting data and publishing data on price. And this is on price in terms of rank, in terms of median price. I just want you to pay attention to the right side of it. You see there, number one is Japanese. In fact, the most expensive restaurants in New York City are Japanese. That's remarkably new. New from, say, compared to French, which has been top for almost 150 years, since almost the middle of the 19th century, when French restaurant cuisine kind of conquered the world, so to say, in terms of its culinarity. Then American or New American, continental is going out of fashion. Continental used to be what Americans think about expensive European hotel food. Italian, the data here on Italian between 1986 and 2016 looks like it is falling in rank in terms of price. Remember, this is ranked by price, where price is a surrogate for prestige. I'm going to unpack that a little bit. The Italian data looks like it is declining, but in fact, Italian food is both becoming more popular. It is the most popular cuisine in the United States, and specifically in New York City, that I'm interested in this question of soft power in global cities. And but this data appears to go down, partly because pizzerias join this kind of a data set, and the average price comes down, although in general, the prestige and price of Italian food started going up by about the 1980s. Spanish food, predictably, Ferran Adria and the whole group, El Bulli, and then Greek, you see, Korean, fastest rising, and I'm going to talk about that. It was already showing up in the 1986 to 2001 data. It is even more ubiquitous today. And then you have Vietnamese, Mexican. You see Indian there about 10th or 12th. This is in New York City. And I have studied New York City. I've studied about a dozen global cities. And I'm going to present data from a couple of them, and especially a London example, which, of course, where Indian food does better in terms of global cities outside of India than many other cities, including, in fact, New York City. Since this was Zagat's data over time, this is more recent data, and this is Yelp. And unfortunately, Yelp, we do not have a long data set over a period of time. What I want you to pay attention to is the y-axis, the vertical axis, where you see by popularity, which is in New York City today. Italian food is the most popular, then Chinese and Mexican, they're the top three. Seoul, then Japanese, New American, Southern, Spanish, Thai. Again, you see Indian there about what, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. This is in terms of popularity, okay, in your y-axis. On your x-axis, you see, I want you to pay attention to the data in green, which is pricey, expensive restaurants within that category. So in the top category, 12% of Italian restaurants are high-end restaurants, if price is a good surrogate for high-end, which is in fact part of the definition of high-end. Only 2% of Chinese restaurants in New York City are high-end. 6% of Mexican restaurants high-end. That's in fact an interesting development. That's a relatively recent development, and will have some impact on thinking about migration, hard power, and soft power. Seoul, that has been largely last 20 years, that has been doing very well, partly in the wake of various kinds of cultural movements, including Black Lives Matter. Japanese, as I say, has been playing very kind of well. But if you look at Indian, about 3% of Indian restaurants in New York City are high end. And that has something, my argument is that has something to do with prestige of Indian food and its limitations. And I will talk about the challenges and limitations. Of course, in some ways, this is predictable. The London data, and I have studied about a dozen cities in the world, Berlin, Frankfurt. I have not studied every global city. And I will, for instance, encourage some of you to work on other cities like Dubai, Bangkok, where in fact Indian food does much better, partly because of the nature of the circulation. London, I'll take this example. As you can see, Indian replaces Italian at the top, but Italian is still popular. The y-axis here is all popularity, okay, from the number of hits. American, Chinese, Thai, etc. Again, if you look at the green data, which is about pricey expensiveness, and remember, I'm using price as a surrogate for prestige. Indian food, about 12% of Indian restaurants are high-end, which is much higher than in New York City. But in fact, if you look at the rest of the data, the most high-end restaurants are almost half the restaurants are French restaurants in London. So you have French there. The other top numbers are Spanish, Japanese, almost that predictable, Italian there, American, and then you get to Indian, Thai, Indian, etc. So here again is the question of popularity and prestige. And prestige I'm using as a surrogate for soft power with certain kinds of limitations about it. Coming back to the city, I have studied most deeply, kind of most densely, and most of my argument will be based on this global city, which is New York City. And of course, New York City is going to become less important in the 21st century. Other global cities will become more important, just like New York City came into play at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. The center of gravity of capital accumulation is shifting. Has shifted to the Pacific, is shifting to East Asia. Places like, for instance, Shanghai, Tokyo, Taipei are much more important, will become much more important in the near future. But since I'm a historical sociologist, I tend to look at the present by looking what came before. In this example, this is New York City Michelin data 2024. You will again see the most, this is about coverage. Michelin covers about 500 restaurants in New York City, ranks them, gives them various kinds of stars and bibs out of, to give you a sense, 25,000 restaurants. So there are 25,000 restaurants in New York City. About five of them have some kind of Michelin consecration. In that, you see American contemporary categories, Italian regional categories. These are, by the way, fuzzy categories. They change. They are not always based on ethnicity and nation, but many still are. And I use these classification nominally. That is, if they call themselves something, I call them, for instance, if they call themselves Italian, I call them Italian. I don't go and look closely and argue whether it's really Italian food or Italian American food for the purposes of this project here. There you can see Indian again, somewhere between about 10 or 12 there, after Mediterranean, after Korean, after Mexican, after French, after Chinese, after Japanese, etc. You can see what's happening as a pattern here that is developing in terms of its rank. I've looked at Michelin data most closely from 2022. For instance, I've scraped data from every restaurant evaluated by Michelin, and then looked at the average price, median price. And this is, again, that coverage. 2006 is the year Michelin comes to New York City. And 2022, in this case, the most detailed one. You see Indian food somewhere there, about 2% of Michelin consecrated restaurants are Indian compared to 20% American. Say Italian is 22. You can see also interesting patterns where Italian coverage is going down a little bit, mostly to make room for Italian, and French coverage is going down, mostly to make room. If you look at Chinese data there, and Mexican and Korean, you can see doubling, tripling, and quadrupling. Chinese number of restaurants covered by Michelin has moved from 3% to 6%, double there. Mexicans from 2 to 6%, 3 times there. Korean 1% to 4%, 4 times there. And I'll talk about some of these cuisines as they emerge in New York City and global city, and what that might illuminate about questions of power. This is price, median price. I took all the Michelin, all the price of all the dishes in Michelin evaluated restaurants in New York City. I have done that in 2022. I haven't done this for 2024. I will do that probably next year before my next book comes out, which this will be part of my next book. But important trend here is, and this is quite standard now, sushi restaurants, omakase restaurants are the most expensive restaurants by far, as you can see, $235. And then you have what is Michelin classifies as contemporary. It's mostly contemporary American, which is American with a slice of Italian, with a slice of Japanese, and a bit of Korean kimchi on the side, if you want to think about that. Steakhouse, French, seafood, and Indian price you see is down there about $47.50 as a median price amongst the entrees. These are all about entrees. I desegregate them. Segregate them by dishes, and this is price of. And if you, what I'm pointing to is a hierarchy of price. If you step back from the material, and you basically see in many global cities, and in this specific case, New York City, a basically Euro-American Japanese centrism. And I'll talk about the Japanese because that's the major change at the end of the 20th century and the early 21st century. I look at data, and it'll be in my next book on World's 50 Best. Basically, all the restaurants at the top of World's 50 Best are Europe, US, and Japan based. For the first time, we had Peru, Lima is going to play an important role, and I'm going to show you some data on it. Never from South Asia, the Middle East, all of Africa, other than, of course, some South Asian examples like Gagan, in mostly Bangkok and Dubai begins to play a role, which is largely related to high-end tourism and the flight of capital in different ways. And I'm going to talk about that. There's a strong relationship. In fact, if you look at soft power of the, and I'm going to Japan, France, Italy, Spain, Republic of Korea, if you look at Human Development Index, which is in fact a quite solid marker of soft power. India comes at the end of that, and it's, I mean, in some ways you see, I think that Indian interesting comparable figures are really with Turkey, Vietnam, and we will look at that comparison down the road. I, in fact, think the HDI, which is basically about longevity, how long people live, people's education, and per capita income, is an important, in some ways, predictor of soft power, which is, of course, is one of the challenges that we face. I'm talking about cuisine today. Others, as I have said before, you can do a similar analysis with Nobel. You can do Booker, where Indian, in fact, novels do much better. Music, movies, and you can take different sites. These are, because I am speaking to you from New York City, I'm referencing some of this. These will change in the near future. But one of the interesting things to note in some ways is Indian high-end cuisine does less well than Indian literature globally, okay, or Indian fashion, attire, and we will see, and maybe the kind of you can develop some of the hypotheses linked to that, why that might be the case. There are certain advantages. India, in fact, this year, this is from The Economist, came to become the source of the largest diaspora in the world. With the diaspora, you also have different kinds of interventions in the world. And I'm going to look at the American data to show how that shows up or does not show up in the discussion. And if you have been following the American elections, you know Indians figure in kind of a direct and indirect way in terms of various diasporas in the political organization of the two major parties. India becomes kind of the largest source of diaspora coming out of this large number, which is about almost 300 million. And in fact, here you have on the left the destination, which is United States, Germany, Saudi Arabia. On the right, you have the source of migration. India, Mexico, etc. And in fact, it complicates claims of soft power when a nation is an exporter of poor people in the world in complicated ways. India is a good example. Mexico is another example, and we're going to talk about that. This is the data. It's a slightly cluttered data, but I want you to pay attention to where I'm listing almost all the major powers, culinary powers in the world, and as marked by World's Top 50, Michelin, etc., which have their very, very stringent limitations. And in fact, this will show some of the limitations. The second column there is per capita GDP. The third is the Hensley Passport ranking. That will become important because I think this consecration of food and cuisine, high-end cuisine, is related to high-end travel. And that is related to access to visa-free travel. There are about, again, I'm approximating, there are about 200 countries in the world. You will see the top soft power. You can travel to about 190, 180 countries in the world without a visa. It's electronic visa, visa on arrival, or no visa at all. And if you have an Indian passport, which I do, for instance, you can go to about 58 countries, mostly small islands in the world. And that is an important marker of, in fact, direct relationship between state power and soft power. And part of my argument is that, and you see the comparison there, I think a good example is, let's take Peru for an example. A lot of people say that if Peru did it with its food in terms of cuisine, India can do it. And you look at GDP per capita, Peru's GDP per capita is about 3.5 times more than India. I think GDP per capita is important. Anyone with a Peruvian passport can travel to 141 countries without visa. India is 58. And then I'll give you this very kind of an intriguing data, which is, are you a US military? Were you ever occupied by the US military? And are you a part of the outer empire of the US? You will see there's a strong relationship between US Cold War ally and US military occupation. You take France, you take Japan, you take Italy, in fact, you take Republic of Korea, that's going to play an important role. And the last column is the column there on major source of poor migrants, because I think my argument is it's inversely related. And I'm going to develop these arguments here. So accumulation of culinary capital appears to depend on per capita GDP. If we take all the other cases, France, Spain, Nordic countries, Italy, etc. And peculiarly, there's a strong correlation between US military occupation and not a source of major power. And as I've said before, center of gravity of the world economy. Getting a little closer to this construction of soft power and hard power, because Joseph Nye is the one who coined the term soft power, notes that, for instance, it's not just related to diaspora, but one of the liabilities he explicitly talks to The Economist is that India has a lot of very poor people. So in some ways, one of the ways I am arguing to acquire soft power, in fact, is to change the sociology of Indian upward mobility in some ways. And we're going to talk a little more about it. I'm going to come back to this visa, which is, again, the same data. You look number of countries, about 200 in the world. India is in the bottom of that list amongst those with substantial hard power, but relatively less soft power in terms of paperwork, because the world still moves on paperwork or digital work. So viewing from outside, from far away, I'm looking at it from New York City, because we all our views are views from somewhere, and they're limited by that, and mine is limited by that, but it also throws some light on the nature of it. And of the central assets of Indian culinary power, of course, is its range, variety, multiplicity. And in fact, honestly, I think it is because India does not have a reduction of nationalist cuisine, which is usually in some ways linked to kind of forms of flattening. There are other assets. Looking at it from New York City, if you want to drill down into the kind of H-1B visas, in terms of Indians who migrate to the US, there are two streams. There are undocumented and documented with relatively low Anglophonity and education credentialing, and Indians come with some of the highest credentialing, along with poor migrants. Indian household income is very high in the United States, and those are, of course, predictors of what could be power of. You see that in Indian politics, American politics, Indians. But in terms of cultural capital, in terms of culinary capital, it shows up less. It shows up more in writing than in the food itself. Indianish writers have come to now join, like Tejal Rao, who comes to India from East Africa. Her family, Priya Krishna, New York Times restaurant critic, is of Indian heritage, not Indian by passport, by Indian heritage. And certain other people have talked about certain cultural capital, certain cultural assets about it. I was just looking at the IIC, India International Center, Food Cultures of India, special issue that came out. I have contributed a piece in there, and some of the argument made here is there in an earlier version of it. Other people talk about, I think Colleen Taylor-Sen talks about vegetable food forward meals for sustainable developments, where in fact India could claim substantial soft power credentials. The other side of it, of course, is the liabilities. India is also in the news for diet-based violence. I don't think that does much to Indian soft power, and that's one of the liabilities amongst other liabilities that I'm going to talk about. Indian elites are also circulating in this. Again, remember, this is not about which food is great, and this is not about in terms of the Indian food, and various kinds of food is terrific. The argument is not about that. The argument is about cultural consecration. In some ways, the analysis is a kind of a Bourdieuian analysis, and I will build on my teachers, which is Giovanni Arrighi and Emmanuel. Here talks about circulation of Indian elites. There are about 4,000 to 5,000 Indian millionaires who expected to outmigrate to places like Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and we have relatively less work in those domains. And the last point here is to say, hopefully some of you will be doing work on that, in some ways bringing the view from other global cities, which in some ways will be in some dialogue in relationship to London, Berlin, Frankfurt. I have done mostly cities of the Western world. Implications here, there is a hierarchy of taste. I'm going to talk about it. Poor immigrant foods, Indian food is changing. Its association between class and culinarity is changing, but still strongly associated with, in some ways, a poor country. And there's a certain kind of mobility and embodied materiality. High-end Indian cuisine does better in other global cities like Dubai, Bangkok, Singapore, but not in every other global city which is not Western. It doesn't do that much better in Tokyo, Shanghai, Ho Chi Minh City, Taipei. And that's the center of gravity of the world economy. So let's take the most successful cases of recent upward mobility of culinary capital, Japan being the dominant power in this case, as I have shown before. The French dominated Western culinarity, high-end culinarity for about 2 centuries, from the early parts of the 18th century, early parts of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, into the middle of the 20th century. The Japanese rise to power is linked to post-war Japan's economic growth. We cannot disassociate it. Although in some ways Japanese soft power was already visible in the 19th century, and that is linked to Joseph Nye's. If you read his book, he repeatedly gives the example of Japanese cultural power, which is linked to Japonisme, which, if you follow, say, Impressionism, if you follow, say, Western high-end music, you will see the strong influence of Japanese aesthetic claims. Impressionism is strongly shaped by the end of the 19th century Japonisme, so it is linked to the rise of Japan as a major military naval power in the 19th century, and then it reemerges back again under American tutelage after the Second World War. If you follow comics, manga, animation, men's fashion, by the way, Japanese have been conquering the world in various ways. Brands like, for instance, Uniqlo, Kamakura shirts, and it gives birth to something called Ametora, which is a Japanese enunciation of American traditional, which in some ways becomes the preserve of this kind of American traditional, where in fact it loses ground to hip hop on its home base in American cities in some ways. Overall, if you do the sweep of Japanese culture in the end of the 19th century and 20th century to the 21st century, Japan is, we forget today, Japan used to be known for what Chinese in some ways is known in a caricature in people's world for cheap toys, what often you can call useful machines like car, the example I gave you of clothing, and increasingly of fantasy machines. And there's an interesting cycle underneath that cycle, which is Japanese pop culture figures proliferated as the economy came to a grinding halt in the 1990s with the collapse of the financial market and end of real estate boom, where in some ways, this is my professor's argument, Wallerstein, he says cultural capital lives in the afterglow of economic growth. Okay, there's a big cycle and there are smaller cycles within it. So it might be one of the arguments I'm making here is that Indian cultural capital will glow a little later because Indian hard power, Indian capital is just emerging as a major player in the world. If you follow the sociologist James Farrar's work in his recent book here, he clearly articulates as Asia has risen in economic importance, the countries in the region have an increasingly powerful effect, where food culture is seen as one form of cultural commodity that is linked to national, regional, local prestige, etc., etc. It's the link between, again, hard power and soft power that I'm trying to make. If you follow comic books to culinarity, you will see very clearly this retort. I don't know whether you remember Black Rain. It's an ancient movie compared to some of your age. Michael Douglas's kind of sidekick says, music and movies are all your culture is good at. Make machines. This is his Japanese sidekick who's saying that. Now China makes the machines, and Japan probably makes the cultural idiom in many domains, including the comic and the culinary. And this is, of course, the changing nature. By the way, I've been talking largely of global cities, global style. There are local iterations, very interesting work happening, emerging out of India from the Northeast, for instance, where certain regions of India where Japanese and Korean culture plays an important role in local subaltern assertions about it, partly in face of Indian racism and colorism and marginalization of the Northeast. I'm not going to get into that. As I said, the view is from far, and the view is from New York City, which is my area of specialization. There are many in the audience today who know much more about that association, and I'm beginning to see their work. Here is my kind of the broadest argument. I'm just checking time. I'm about 30 minutes into my talk. So in some ways, the US first destroyed Japan in the Second World War and then rebuilt it under its anti-communist tutelage. The rise of Japanese economy in the second half of the 20th century would not have been possible without the Cold War and the Japan's location vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And it played a role in terms of American investment in the economy and especially access to the US home market. Okay, the Japanese economy grew in double digits during the Korean War. The Korean War will play a crucial role for Korea's emergence and Japan's emergence as an economic power, as will the Vietnam War. So there's a direct relationship to economic power. In this case, $3 billion in orders for food, clothing, ammunition, and vehicles, for instance. And then you have the opening of what is called neoliberalism, Reagan's deregulation in 1982, that opens up, in fact, the American market for Japanese innovations, from G.I. Joe to Transformers to Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And you often see American studios mimicking Japanese style animation like an Avatar, etc. And if you just take the case of Pokemon, it's a kind of a good illustrative case. At the end of 1999, Pokemon had earned $5 billion, about the size of the rest of the US gaming industry. So this is this argument about fantasy machines here, back here, okay, where the Japanese culture in some ways becomes an exporter based on the hard power development. This is what I call the military journalist tourist complex. And this is partly, you can see in Madhur Jaffrey's quip to me once. She asked me, why do Americans love the food of those they have gone to war with? Japan, South Korea, and then Taiwan, Vietnam, you will see an important role. And my argument is it is linked to military occupation, which sends young people there, young Americans, who in fact acquire a taste in all their, by the way, appetites, and return home. And American military goes hand in hand with American journalists who write about these places, and about a generation later, tourists follow. So there's a direct relationship between military complex, journalist complex, and tourism, which is linked to culture power. As you can see, what I'm pointing to is a link between hard power and soft power. Then there are things like the role of domestic upward mobility of a class of people. That has happened with Italians, for instance. But I think Italian food in the United States also acquired a certain kind of a prestige in the wake of the Second World War, after the US occupation, when young men went to Italy, in fact, occupied, acquired a taste, and about a generation later was followed by tourists, and the Italian were allowed access to American markets. Very similar structure. What happens to Germany, what happens to Italy, what happens to France, happens to Japan and South Korea. So there's a direct relationship. And my big argument here is people often talk of culture as if it's just spinning in the air without talking of the hard power infrastructure, economics, and geopolitics, which is fine. But in some ways, I think it doesn't tell us the whole story. It in some ways marks an easy boosterism. The argument is if only India could do some propaganda about Indian food will become more important in global cities. Not so easy, my argument is. And that is linked to, in some ways, different kinds of economic and geopolitical reasons. You can see with Korean cool again. I mean, Korea is even more a product of American empire. In terms of war, in terms of money spent, then of course it accumulates soft power through the Asian Games, Olympics, and the World Cup, and begins to, in some ways, there's a cultural flow back now. Korean movies like Parasite and of course shows and movies like Squid Games are doing very well. The Korean case is basically a generation later of what happened to Japan, in some ways a generation later with what happened to France and Italy. So the crudest way to make my argument is I'm saying there is no global sushi or bibimbap in global cities without hot and cold wars. And they are related, including, of course, if you remember Gangnam Style, which became a blockbuster in terms of on YouTube, and the number of hits and people watched it, and that's linked to upward mobility of a particular neighborhood. This is Gangnam Style, which is linked to the rise of Korea. Korea's per capita GDP is very, very, very high, as you saw on the earlier list. And important observers make comments like Obama about Korean soft power, Korean wave. So in some ways, what I'm saying in the crudest way is culinarily, war is the most successful form of cultural contact. If it is cultural contact with a major media power, economic power, military power like the United States. It is astonishing how, in fact, restaurant reviewers, people who talk about Japanese culture and Korean culture in the United States or any global city, totally miss this larger geostrategic kind of an implication of a form of contact, which is when Americans say Asia, they mean East Asia, partly because that is exactly their contact with East Asia. And it is a military contact. And out of that comes cultural contact with various forms. Lovely studies on this can kind of soft power, and my argument here is soft power can only be built on hard power. I'll give you an example. All this optimistic talk about soft power without conversations about hard power misses, for instance, if you look at my third point here, most dramatically, capital in Africa is not yet at the center or shade of accumulation in global comparative sense. In none of those lists, you see any mention of vast, sophisticated, multiple idioms of culinary cultures of parts of Africa, like Nigeria has as rich and multiple a linguistic culture of foodscape as India, for instance, in terms of its regionality, no mention of it. And no mention of it in any of these lists. They will have a French restaurant in South Africa, okay, world's 50 best, and almost no restaurant out of sub-Saharan Africa, partly because it's very clearly a relationship with hard power. It's a very clearly a conversation about capitalism. And often excessive attention to soft power without attention to hard power and geopolitics in some ways ends up in this kind of a naive optimism about what cultural diplomacy can do. Look what the Koreans did. Look what the Peruvians did. We can do it. And as I said, it's linked to per capita GDP. It is linked to, in some ways, the power of your passport. And those things are not easily changed just by kind of claims about how great a particular culture is. By the way, Japanese food is great. Korean food is great. I love it. I eat them. Indian food is great. Nigerian food is great. None of this is to say these foods are not great, but they are great, but they are not culturally consecrated by global elites, because they are not at the center of capital accumulation and not linked to hard power. And in some cases, hard power that has been made invisible in the case of Japan and Korea, because we are only looking at the very short run. My argument is based on basically Gramsci's notion of hegemony, developed by Giovanni Arrighi. And if you are particularly interested in some of these, just checking the time, books, I would say maybe Adam Smith in Beijing, and Geopolitics and Geoculture. There are limits to their work. It's not like they give all the answer, but one in some ways build on this question of what is the relationship between hard power and soft power, which seems to be very, very strongly correlated. Rituparna, I'm going to do a time check here. I have one more argument, but I don't think I have time for that.
No, I think it's okay. You can go ahead. Yes, yes, sure, please.
Okay, 5 more minutes. I'm going to just skim through this argument. The other side of this argument is the kind of a peculiar repulsion from spices in terms of Western cuisine. And there I'll argue about the birth of this hierarchy of senses in dominant Western aesthetic. And I'll give you one quotation here. I think this one, Bahauddin Dagar's, the musician, noted, it's not surprising to hear a pandit or an ustad say, उसे खाना ही ठीक से नहीं आता है, वो संगीत क्या बजा कैसा बजाएगा. Okay, how will he ever play music? He doesn't even know how to eat well. This is a very kind of a South Asian, Persian, Arabic sensibility about taste. That palatal taste is linked to aesthetic taste, very different from what happened in Western modernity after Kant in terms of rationality. You see critiques of that in Pierre Bourdieu's work as a sociologist in Distinction, where he links it to class and aesthetic judgment. And in this is relate in the Western world, and this is the crux of my argument in this section, which is that spices were highly valued, highly venerated by Western elites until you have Western modernity about 1750, which is the point of bifurcation in the Western world, where basically spices were replaced by herbs. And this new ideology emerged. You see that prefigured in 1650s, where cabbage soup, taste of cabbage, leeks of leeks, turnips of turnips, very different of layered taste in, say, South Asian food, Indian food, Persian food. And this developed out of a rejection of spices that Silkia Jainer calls basically the coloniality of modern taste in gastronomic thought. I'll give you one example out of it, maybe here, Paul Friedman's work, the decline in terms of spices. Spices came from highly valued, expensive commodities to basically associated with cheap immigrant taste, like authenticity in ethnic food in New York City, even now, is in some ways linked to spicy food. So it's spicy, it can be good, but it cannot be expensive. It cannot be high prestige. So Friedman points to this decline was gradual in the use of spices amongst Western elites, but inexorable and in fact quite extreme. The wealthy people of Europe no longer like the food like you can see with Italian, Spanish, and French foods today. Spiciness would be seen by European American commentators as a metonym for the food of poor immigrants, as ethnic food that I have written extensively about, including what the food of the Sicilians that will acquire prestige much later, which is at the tail end of the 20th century. Of course, when I make this argument about Western aesthetic and Eastern aesthetic, I don't want to overgeneralize. Western aesthetic is more complicated than just Kant. There's Baudelaire, who links it to intoxication. There are others like Diana Taylor who talk about Western aesthetics in dance, like mudra, for instance, hand gestures, that I think room for a lot of innovative and interesting work possible. But the dominant dimension has been, in some ways, the Kantian one of this distant intellection. This is the part I'm going to skip, where I point to the role that visuality play, which has come into play very interestingly in Indian food, and how in fact street foods has entered Indian high-end restaurant globally, and specifically in New York City, to bring the two ends of my argument together. In some ways, Pani Puri, etc., because of the exploration of visuality. Because in some ways, the idioms of street food are a lot more amenable to kind of visual representation. So where in some ways technology and visual representation plays a role. If you're interested, you will see these PowerPoints. You can send me an email. I can send it to you personally, my larger argument. So here is returning to Veer Sanghvi's question, which is nobody disputes that Indian food is now taken more seriously globally. But what about Indian restaurants? Which is my response is true. But Indian culinary soft power in high-end restaurants is in fact a laggard. And that is related to Western standards of hierarchy of taste, which is this question of spices, this question of good taste. And the other is the nature of Indian demographic change, including high levels of poverty and emigration of the poor. So my conclusion is here, soft power is not so easy to get, especially in food compared to film or music, for instance. And that has to do with the fact that you can send music, you can send film, you can watch it from a distance with almost no transportation costs. Okay. Well, food you still have to eat and get there. That's why visas matter. Okay, that materiality matters. Most people who write about food, critics about food, cannot write about food if they have not eaten it in a particular context. So there's a frictional materiality to food that is different from novels, music, and film. That's why I think in some ways food is going to be a laggard, a more conservative domain than others. And the kind of, that's some of my argument. Not every great power ends up as culinary or musical great power. In fact, United States was not considered that. Great Britain was not considered that. But those who do so in the modern world are never poor and marginal to the global world economy and cultural politics, because we still live in some ways global capitalism. So I'll leave you with a question. We have theories of the relationship, as I said, between architecture and capitalist modernity, between literature and capitalist modernity, between art and even labor process and capitalist modernity. But we really do not have an aesthetic theory about cooked food and capitalist modernity. So maybe it's time for people like you to in some ways develop the argument and theory about it. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ray, for that very riveting and thought-provoking talk. I think there's plenty to think about and also discuss. I'm opening the floor to questions and comments. So if anyone has a question and they would want to ask, please unmute yourself and do the needful. Just one request, keep your questions short since we are short of time. If you don't want to unmute yourself, you can also put your question in the chat box. There's already a comment by Lily. Hi, Lily, in the chat box about the nature of colonialism. If it would explain why Tokyo is our typical culinary global city and not, say, Seoul. So if you'd want to comment on that.
Lily, absolutely right. And in fact, James Farrar and David Wang's, the edited book, the first couple of chapters is exactly about the coloniality, in fact, of Japanese power. For instance, the most expensive restaurants in Shanghai are today also Japanese, high-end Japanese. So it'll be fantastic to do an analysis of Tokyo and Shanghai, for instance, and Taipei. So you're exactly right. It is a certain kind of colonial relationship. And of course, remember, I mean, the Indian-British case is an interesting case. It is not always that with coloniality comes cultural power. In some ways, the British impacted Indians in terms of what we drink, tea and whiskey, etc. The colonized power impacted much more on what the British eat. So it's not always a one-to-one directionality, but you're absolutely right. It is the role of Japanese imperialism, which is centered to. In fact, my next book is probably going to be called Cultural Imperialism and Culinary Capital, which is almost has vanished out of the discussion with an exclusive attention to soft power and the horizontality of these various capitalist powers. So yes, you're right. Okay, wait for the next question.
Yes. If anyone has any question, please feel free.
I do.
Yes, Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, Krish. Spices. The connection, and this goes to colonialism also, about controlling the emotions of the population with the energy of the population, where spices have always been connected to sex, sexual energy, spices and women. Certain foods need to be kept away from women. We have this well into the beginning of the 20th century. So I'm just wondering where, because men in the military, they're going to eat anything, but women in control. And also spices linger in baking. They disappear.
Baking, yes, exactly.
They disappear in the hotline food, but they linger in baking. And the Middle Eastern influence lasts into the 19th century with the use of rose water, which we're just getting back to now. But all of those early recipes have rose water, cinnamon, nutmeg, the Asian spices. So I don't know what I'm saying, Linda. Exactly.
No. I know 2 points you made. 2 points you made, which is very important. One has to specify the argument further, which is spices don't just vanish, they migrate. And it's interesting how they migrate. And of course, think about baking, especially domestic baking, which is also a highly gendered function in some ways. That's a beautiful argument, which has to be used to qualify my argument, qualify Paul Friedman's argument, qualify Ken Albala's argument as to what happens to spices. Your second point. Then your first point, which is a very good point, and what I say did not address that at all, and I don't have an answer to that question. That needs further thinking and writing. And your first point is about gender appetite and the role of spices. And one of the arguments Silkia Jainer makes in some ways is, of course, coloniality and masculinity. Okay, and in India you can clearly see that where there's a kind of a recoil, and that is partly linked to the mutiny and the first Indian, in some ways, the revolution, where the British react to it by, in fact, forcing, as others have written, and I think Lily has written also about it, about a separation of British men and assertion of racial superiority from the native population. In this case, separation from Indian women, separation of households, especially food, because the anxiety there was, as your point was, that some of these British men were going native. And that doesn't work very well for the racist project. And so capitalist racism works by this stringent distinction and differentiation between the two. So that also is a very important point.
And just one of the most important men who went native was Yale. And that is why his name is on the university, because his dowry to the college included nutmeg, which, then could set you up for life, like 2 nutmegs. Exactly. And he contributed entire jars and Madras cloth and all kinds of things from India, and had an Indian family.
Linda, you should be writing about this, right? Have you written about it? We can read it.
I am. I'm redoing the 4th edition of Cuisine and Culture to make it right, to update it. And this is fantastic. So yeah, I'm going to email you because I do want this PowerPoint.
Perfect. And can I respond to? Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot, Linda. And keep me posted about your work. Excellent questions. Khadija, a very interesting point in the question of authenticity. Okay. Of course, for Indians who have an Indian palate, when you eat Indian food in New York City, it either does not taste that Indian or Indian in a particular way. So part of it, that aversion and restriction is linked to that. And I haven't figured out why, for instance, most high-end Indian restaurants, including the highly valued one, have not, for instance, elaborated the rich Indian. My argument is Indian cuisine is rich in, for instance, dals, various dals with various levels of spices, various levels of consistency. Even at the high-end innovative Indian restaurant where you go, it's basically 2-3 dals. It's kind of with overcloying garam masala that is uninteresting. So your critique is partly right. But remember, that's only not with Indian food. If you talk to Italians about Italian American food, you'll see the kind of disdain they have about Italian American food. It says that's not Italian food. That, of course, is, think about General Tso's chicken and Chinese food. So it's General Tso's chicken is like chicken tikka masala of Indian food. So that happens, in fact, to all the cuisine. So in some ways, cannot explain why still Italian American food does well and not Indian American food. Well, and it maybe does explain a bit on Chinese American, Indian American more than Italian American. Good question, but I think the answer is probably authenticity. None of this food, when it travels, is authentic in the old sense of the way the food was. There's, by the way, a beautiful quote. An Italian guy comes and he eats a spaghetti with meatballs in New York City. He says, "Whoa, spaghetti with meatballs and Parmigiano Reggiano. We should invent it back in Italy." So Italian Americans, Americans are thinking this is Italian food. It is Italian American food. And those huge meatballs, and all this cheese and on the pasta, in some ways is a kind of a bastardization of Italian food. That's the nature of food that travels. All food that, and I put bastardization within quotation mark, all food that travels in some ways, loses some of its elements, acquires new elements. Good question, but I don't think it fully answers the question. If Italian food could do it, even Japanese food. I mean, California roll, it's a totally California invention. Okay, Japanese don't eat it at all, and it goes back to Japan. So the California roll is the chicken tikka masala, is the General Tso's chicken of Japanese food. That happens to all the cuisines. So it doesn't specifically explain why Indian cuisine does less well at the high end. But good question, good things to think about.
Right. Are there any more questions? Well,
also feel free to do comments. Yeah, feel free to go to comments. Yes,
please feel free to leave comments. Linda has a bigger question about authenticity, but I would like to add one question that I have. It's a more basic kind of a question. I see a lot of young people who are probably exploring food as a site to do research, join this discussion. And I want to ask that you said that you're a historical sociologist and at the same time also talk about materiality of food. So what would be some of the ways or rather methodological toolkits to look at food as a site to, explore the larger social, political, and cultural? If you could, talk a little bit about that.
Lovely question. And a good question as a teacher. And in fact, you would have seen the section where I talk about Instagram. I think it's a very positive thing. It allows, for instance, younger women who stay at home with children, to make an argument. Indian food writers used to be all men who never cooked. They ate like gourmand. Now, for the first time, we are beginning to see, at least in terms of the global discussion, women's writing. And I think Vivek Menzies, the Indian journalist, told me once what writing for cricket did to Indian writing of Indian men, like, say, Ramachandra Guha, is now doing to Indian women's writing, which is going to absolutely fascinating domain about it. So that's the public culture about it. Now, in terms of sociological analysis, a couple of things, and some I see Ishita in there, who's doing work, for instance, on domestic migration. There's very little work on food changing in domestic migration amongst the poor in various parts of India. India sends out, there are more people traveling within India than all the people traveling internationally in the world. Okay. And we have relatively less analysis of it, study of it. It needs ethnographic, immersive work. It needs, like Ishita is doing, travel on trains, talk to people, go where the working class is going. The working class is moving largely from Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, and Bihar to Delhi, to Mumbai, to Bengaluru. Okay, we need deeper ethnographic work at one level, in closer proximity to the materiality, to the social world. We also need, in some ways, higher level conception, and in some ways, partly to ignore a bit of, I come from historical sociology, but in food studies discussion are so Euro-American centric and so not helpful. And I'll give you a second issue in this and a second methodology. South Asia, specifically India, is the land of where you are what you do not eat. You are who you do not eat with. But there's no literature other than the older anthropological literature on that question, because in the Western world, it has all become omnivorousness. In cultural sociology, omnivorousness dominates the discussion, that upper class people eat everyone else's cuisine, they acquire cultural capital. Correct in one way, totally does not work in India. And I think this, I'll end with a kind of that is your space for making a theoretical cultural argument. And I push Indian students, my Indian colleagues, and in some ways that's emerging, like rich literature on Dalit food is emerging, is being written out. Okay, and this is Priscilla Parkhurst Ferguson's argument is cuisine happens when cooking leaves the kitchen into some social media, into Instagram, into print writing. Okay, so the possibilities and the potentialities of sociological theorization, okay, is rich in South Asia, partly because most of what's happening in South Asia and many other parts of the world, by the way, Northern theorization are relatively weak and in fact do not work as well. So I'm a bit of an empiricist, and as you saw, I have to swim in data, I have to swim in quotations, I have to swim in ethnographic work. Though this current presentation is not about ethnographic work. I've written about it recently in the anthropology of consciousness, about touch, food, and touch. In that domain, for instance, I have to read up more on touch and untouchability and caste. There's a rich theoretical literature now emerging and rich empirical material. My last point there, I say, at least when I teach in the American context, I say there are at least 22,000 Indian cuisines, because cuisine is linked to dialect, which is linked to, say, the Hindustani saying, kose kose par pani badle chare kose par pani, right? The language changes, and in some ways the water changes, and water is a metonym for taste. The assumption in the Western world, globally, even the Japanese case, Korean case, is the idea that nations have cuisine, okay, like flags, like passports. That's an absurd idea. Nations, in fact, don't have cuisines, okay? Sidney Mintz used to say that, okay? Those are the ways, in some ways, we can challenge with rich empirical material. As I say, I'm a bit of an empiricist about it, which can seriously challenge sociological theorization in cultural sociology, in cultural anthropology, in cultural geography, in, of course, food studies, which is a very tiny field. But those are the ways in which one, and with new subjects coming in. My first example, where women writing, mothers writing, okay, that was never enough room about that. Dalits writing is a way of rethinking culinary culture, and what I think it was Bates who said, schismogenetic repulsion, that people are what their neighbors are not. Okay, people eat what their neighbors do not eat, and India is a lab for that, and one can make very, very interesting arguments that goes counter to the directionality of theorization in the Euro-American academy.
Right. I see two more questions. One from Karthik about the usage of concepts hard and soft power over already existing Bordeusian concepts, economic and symbolic capital. And the other one about India being a very diverse country, if it plays a role in why it's slow at emerging as a culinary soft power.
Excellent questions. Karthik, you are absolutely right. In my book, in fact, that's what I'm going to do, which is why use hard and soft, which was part of it is it's a public visibility of it. But in fact, Bourdieu's concept of economic and symbolic capital probably needs kind of a reconciliation here. And I will be adding basically the Gramscian, where in fact, my argument is really an argument about hegemony. And hegemony is a combination of coercion, bribery, and consent. I think so in some ways, I would be combining hard and soft. I haven't written that chapter, so your question provokes me to pay closer attention to it. Hard and soft power to economic and symbolic capital, and the Gramscian use of coercion, bribery, and consent. And I'm hoping I can synthesize them in new and interesting ways. This book is about 2 years away in terms of being conceived. So good question, Karthik. I don't have an answer to that question, but it's something I need to think about more deeply. Chetna, the diversity, yes. The diversity plays in the way of easy identification of what is Indian food. And part of that is a question of attention of Western elites. All these lists I find them as insider rackets. Like British boys, world's best 50 is largely coming out of British boys, expats traveling globally and estimating what is good. They know very little. They do not know any of the languages. The nature of consecration is changing. The world's 50 best is changing. Michelin is changing. They're trying to accommodate more. Most of them are unequipped to understand Indian regionality. Yeah, I in this piece, I write about how, for instance, an American restaurant reviewer cannot be a reviewer if they do not know the difference between Piedmontese food and Sicilian food, between spaghetti and bucatini. Okay, but New York Times, New Yorker restaurant critics can be restaurant critics without having any idea of the distinction between Gujarati food, Bengali food, and say food from Tamil Nadu. Okay, forget about underneath that. There's a further regionality underneath that. So I think the most interesting thing for food scholars to do, Indian food scholars to do, Indian sociologists to do, in fact, is to go below the nation and go above the nation. In some ways, really, I find a lot of Indian food very similar in that sense to Somali and Ethiopian food for a reason. Long trade in the Arabian Ocean, including, by the way, the use of ghee. Okay, the use of versions of what we would call garam masala about it. So, and this is totally invisible to most Western food critics and restaurant critics, partly because they are not paid for, and they don't get paid to pay attention to distinction. This is where, in some ways, Gramsci's notion of hegemony and Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital comes into play. It is where, for instance, I had to learn about wine and cheese because I needed to work in this domain. Okay, how much of Pete Wells has to learn, who was the New York Times restaurant critic, just stepped down, had to know about dals, for instance. Okay, so hegemony, power distributes attention, okay, to specificity. Or even Indian elites. How many Indian elites know the different kinds of hadia that comes out of tribal societies in Odisha, my state that I come off? Okay, so this is not only at the international level, this is also at the national level. Okay, Indian regionality is acquiring more visibility, largely with women's writing, and I would say mothers' writing. In fact, various regional cuisines from the Northeast, Uttarakhand, Mizo food, Naga food, Odia food, the state I come from. My mother tongue is Odia, my father tongue is Bengali. And so that in some ways is changing, will change. And I think it comes back to my prior point, which is in not so much by eating Indian food, by reading and watching about Indian food, that maybe Western elites who are writing about these foods will change their mind about the nature of these material objects very close to the ground, which are often subaltern practices, not dominant practices, not even in India. So excellent questions.
Thank you. I think we can take one last question, which is from Neha, about the role of food in shaping memory and identity within the Indian diaspora, particularly in English literature. In what ways does food function as a narrative tool for exploring diasporic experiences, cultural preservation, and the complexities of belonging in a transnational context?
Very, very good question. My dissertation, which became my first book, which is The Migrant Table, is almost spends a chapter thinking through, in fact, a literary genre, which is also in some ways gendered in a particular way. Rushdie does write about the Khansama. Rushdie does write about, if you look at his best work, Midnight's Children, pickling of memories. And in some ways, achar making and pickling is a metaphor, in fact, of how societies remember materially, which is, of course, a certain kind of a conquest of time. So excellent point about thinking about food and memory. And I think what you're pointing to is a broader and a wider frame to think about two things, which is how do societies remember? Two, how do societies forget? Societies forget constantly. If you tell most Indians that you didn't have chilies and you didn't have chai, they'll say, are you kidding me? Okay, a couple of 100 years ago, that these are in some ways post-Portuguese and post-colonial. If you read Gandhi is raving and ranting against tea as a foreign colonial import. So in some ways, societies remember and societies forget constantly. Okay, so the interesting story is, how do societies remember, and what are the mechanisms by which societies forget, and what does that have to do with the narrativity, with the telling of certain kinds of stories and not telling of certain kinds of stories? Wherever there is a storyteller, there's also in some ways stories that are not being told. And India is, in some ways, because of deep social inequality. The question I raised, the point I raised about liability in terms of global soft power is also its asset. Its asset is there are so many untold Indian stories about food. India, of course, is kind of a holding pen for millions of billions of stories that have not been told. And in some ways, you're pointing to writing, and that's the second point. You can do writing, you can do long form journalism, you can do fiction, but also what is happening is what print media was to sports, for instance, we can see now digital media can play its role in terms of food. That's why my reference to Instagram, to TikTok, which will play an important role and a different kind of a role, like what print media played, where in some ways narrative fiction print form plays. So beautiful potentiality, possibility, that very inequality, that very burden of not having heard, not being allowed to tell, or not being able to tell some stories provides the room for all of you and others not in this room to, in fact, tell those very stories that people, we in this room, and people outside can learn much about, that in fact we have barely scratched the surface in terms of my field, food studies.
But thank you so much. It's already been past an hour, so I'm once again very grateful to you for honoring the invitation and for this very, very insightful talk. I'm sure that our listeners have a lot to take home back, and the recording would also be uploaded. So if you have any questions or something that you would like to go back to, you can listen to it again. And if you have any questions, feel free to email the speaker, as he has mentioned. So thank you, Professor Ray, and thank you to everyone for joining.
Thank you. Take care. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to such an accomplished audience. I recognize half the names here.
Thank you so much.